Hello, my name is Rocky Myers, and welcome to my History Final, where I will be discussing accessibility, purpose, and control and how it relates to American education. Throughout American history, the education system has been molded according to the agendas and motives of society, specifically by those within society with the means and privilege to impose their values and priorities onto the rest of the population. This can range from promoting accessibility through public programs funded by the government to outright barriers according to race and class. Whatever and whenever progress was made, there always seemed to be a caveat. Sometimes that meant that the new and improved higher institutions such as colleges, universities, and even sometimes high schools were only really available to those of means. In other instances, the accessibility of public schools intended for the common folk or charity schools for the disenfranchised had clear agendas, pushing specific morals, religions, and narratives, and only targeting specific populations. These methods of curating an educated populace continue to this day, and our current system is a descendant of such discriminatory practices. We can begin at, well, the beginning. The development of charity schools, such as those organized by the Society for the Propagation of Gospel in Foreign Parts, the SPG for short, were meant to target the poor and needy whites. This was a relatively huge organization, founded in 1701 and accumulating about 170 missionary stations by the American Revolution in 1765. The stated goal of the SPG was to combat atheism, infidelity, and popish superstition and idolatry. At this time, a lack of religion was conflated with a lack of morals, and so their intent to combat atheism is a clever way of reframing their true intention of promoting Anglicanism as something for the betterment of society. Although their primary audience was needy whites, there were a couple of programs meant for Native and African Americans, but these peoples were skeptical of these institutions, and rightly so, as their mission was essentially indoctrination with a side of literacy. Regardless, the SPG and other missionary societies mostly stuck to handing down religious and cultural values to their own children. It is not only these denominational schools that focus on their children, but in fact during the colonial period, most education was expected to be handled by families, and it wasn't until 1650 that we began to see doctrines such as that in Connecticut, where there are fines for families neglecting to ensure that their children can read and have knowledge of the capital laws. In 1690, there was an addendum specifying that the children must be able to read the Word of God, the Bible, and recite catechisms, which were a teaching method that involved questions and answers, often religious. Moving on to the 19th century, we find Horace Mann advocating so strongly for accessible education that he earns the nickname the Father of the Common School. He believed in an institution that moved away from the highly hierarchical system of the past, where if your family was poor or uneducated themselves, then you had little to no academic prospects. He wanted a system that benefited everybody, stating that education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is the great equalizer in the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. These arguments and emphasis on accessible education had a double edge. While it was understood that education was important for social mobility, this also was a threat to the status quo, which comprised of astounding inequality. The unfortunate legacy of indentured servitude and, indeed, of slavery, which was still very much occurring until the mid-19th century. To prevent African Americans from rising from their oppression, education was explicitly denied to them, both socially and legally. Such laws, known as the Black Laws or Black Codes, were legal doctrines stating that it was a crime to educate a slave or even freedmen, meaning that even well-meaning whites were strongly discouraged from helping because it put them in very real danger themselves. School teachers and the buildings they dared use to educate black children, whether run by African Americans or charitable whites such as the Quakers, were at risk of being attacked and their schoolhouses outright demolished by angry mobs, as demonstrated by this illustration from Harper's Weekly, 1874, which also features a lynched former slave. These laws were partially in response to the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, where the slave Nat Turner, whose ability to read led him to fervently studying the Bible and eventually becoming a radical. His rebellion had a body count of 60, starting with the brutal murder of his master Joseph Travis and his family in the night. The impact of this bloodshed was so strong that it was not only southern states enacting black laws, but also free northern states. Outside of the fear of outright violence, Whites were insecure and anxious that their economic and social statuses would be threatened if black citizens were allowed any type of advancement or social mobility. There is very much a push-down understanding to society based on the flimsy and false belief that one needed someone lower than them in order to retain respectability and clout. The cruelty of the white society was not limited to targeting education, although systems of oppression were built off of this, such as the Grandfather Clause of Louisiana, which states that a man must be able either to read or write, or a property worth $300, which is now $9,400 accounting for inflation, or have a father or grandfather that was able to vote prior to 1867, only 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. This clause clearly targets the illiterate, the poor, and the already disenfranchised, and seeks to keep them voiceless, for fear that they change the rigged and unfair system. This means that the black population was disproportionately affected by this clause, as they were nearly guaranteed unable to vote before 1867, very rarely had their own property, never mind it being worth as much as required, and as mentioned earlier, they were victims of hate crimes if they attempted to gain any type of education. This is not to say that African Americans simply accepted this mistreatment. They often educated each other on the down low, with furtive meetings and careful organization. Many of the educated black folk, such as Frederick Douglass, felt it was their duty to spread knowledge, as they understood how crucial it was, and still is, to raising their brethren out of the depths of systemic oppression. However, those that were free blacks or house slaves and were permitted to learn often had white agendas, white ways of thinking instilled in them, meaning that they were encouraged and taught to look down on other African Americans, especially field hands and poor white trash, perpetuating and promoting social hierarchies. This was in part due to the push-down culture of the time, which applied not only to the whites, but also served to benefit these African Americans by giving them a way to differentiate themselves from undesirables to their masters and white society at large. Other instances of whitening minority populations have roots in the colonial era with the Native Americans, where Indian schools were formed as a way of forcing European education onto them, to civilize and Christianize them. Hence their reluctance and distrust towards missionary schools manned by organizations like the SPG. This practice continued unchallenged by whites until 1779, when Thomas Jefferson started taking action against these practices as governor of Virginia, changing one such Indian school into an institution meant to study their traditions and culture instead. However, this is not to say that such schools were done away with entirely, and the concept that introducing the habit and arts of civilization to Native Americans was for their own good continued well into the 20th century. In fact, it was not only African and Native Americans that were targets of such whitening initiatives in education, but also the wave of immigrants during the early 1900s. While some schools like the Hull House, run by Jane Addams in Chicago, sought to provide vocational and life skills, English classes, and citizenship training, other organizations were blatantly upfront about their intent to Americanize immigrants. Most of these same institutions, mind you, refused to provide these services to African Americans moving north, clearly biased towards fairer skin and seeking to continue the system of oppression divided into the educated whites and disempowered blacks, revealing that they cared little about actual citizens and more about curating a culture that fits a certain elitist ideal. The aspect of progressive education that I primarily want to focus on is the reorganization of the curriculum and the impact that social psychology has had on policymaking. Other forms of elitism occurred during this era can be found in the 1893 report by a committee from the National Education Society. This report was popularly known as, and from here on out is referred to as, the Committee of 10. This report, primarily the work of Charles Eliot, president of Harvard University, placed considerable emphasis on strictly academic subjects. Proposed curriculum included courses still familiar to us today, like geometry and physics, to undeniably cerebral subjects like Latin and astronomy. Unsurprisingly, this proposal was criticized for being impractical for anyone not interested in going to higher education, which is a significant proportion of the population. What use was knowing the difference between a gerund and a gerundive to the everyman? Scott Nearing's 1917 study found that school boards were more than half comprised of bankers, lawyers, manufacturers, doctors, and other such commercial and professional classes, indicating that it was, and still is, No surprise that the understanding of which subjects are worthwhile is skewed towards elitist tendencies and preference. In 1918, the National Education Association published a new report penned by relatively low-key Brooklyn math teacher Clarence Kingsley. Considered the democratic alternative to the Committee of Ten's proposal and reminiscent of Horace Mann's values for common schools, the cardinal rules place an emphasis on developing students into citizens and finding a societal niche to fill. The principles included health, worthy home membership, and worthy use of leisure time, to name but a few of the 7 in total. This curriculum is considered more practical for the majority of the population as it sought to emphasize vocational and life skills. Social scientists criticized the Committee of 10 for failing to take into account the great army of incapables, as the psychologist G. Stanley Hall so eloquently put it. Other ways that these scientists influenced education were not limited to critiques, but also by conducting studies. From 1940 to 1941, the psychologists Mamie and Kenneth Clark conducted a study where they demonstrated the impact that segregated schooling has had on Black children in terms of their self-esteem and self-worth. Their results were disturbing, with 59% of the respondents indicating that the colored doll was the bad doll, while 60% indicated that the white doll was the nice one and the one that they would prefer to play with. It is with the help of this study proving the insidious psychological harm such practices of separate but equal actually have that the verdict of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 came to the decision of desegregation. Nowadays, many of these issues surrounding accessibility, what purpose education serves, and who decides what gets taught still continue. We still see a divide in schools, owed in part to the white flight of Caucasians to the suburbs in response to the desegregation due to the decision of Brown v. Board in the early 1950s, leaving inner-city schools with less funding and to become mostly minority students. Although racial segregation is not overtly condoned, it is no coincidence that the demographics are as such. Further, as integration was enacted, divisions based on class arose, and we still see the Committee of Ten's proposals in separate, elite high schools, such as private and magnet schools, while the cardinal principles are slowly being phased out. There continues to be issues of elitism, whether in terms of race or class, and policies such as affirmative action and the free application for federal student aid, FAFSA, work to address these power imbalances through positive discrimination, providing financial and educational opportunities that our predecessors could not have envisioned. While the legacy of slavery and imperialist values still exist in the modern curriculum and system, we also find that slowly but surely, measures are being put in place to eventually rectify these injustices. With our current society, we find that there is less emphasis overall on practical skills such as cooking and sewing, due surely in part to industrialization, providing us the convenience and abundance of options through chain restaurants and fast fashion, and it makes sense that our educational values change with our culture. In many ways, the education system is still elitist and archaic, and many students feel that they spend hours dedicating their time to subjects that are ultimately redundant to them, and see little to no value in learning for knowledge's sake. This has always been an issue for education. People since the colonial era have challenged whether it is worth the time, effort, and money to fund these programs, and schools are often in jeopardy of budget cuts and fewer resources. However, there have always been persistent and recurring waves of reform, from Horace Mann to the cardinal principles to the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education, focusing on designing a system that is accessible and valuable for everybody. And if the last few hundred years of American education are anything to go off of, then the future holds promise of better and more accessible opportunities for all.